Imagine a land where the rolling hills and fertile valleys hold stories not just of beauty, but of battles fought, leaders overthrown, and dreams tested by the fires of war. Uganda's history is more than dates and names. It is a journey through courage and chaos, where every chapter shaped the heartbeat of a nation still striving for lasting peace. When Uganda became independent from Britain in 1962, the moment was filled with hope and celebration. Yet beneath the joy, the nation carried the weight of a complex colonial past. During British rule, the country's borders had been drawn without regard to the deep cultural, ethnic, and linguistic differences among its many communities. Groups like the Baganda, Akoli, Langi, and others had distinct histories and ways of life, but colonial policies often favored some over others, creating imbalances in power and opportunity. The British administration had relied heavily on certain groups for military service and civil positions, while sidelining others, planting seeds of rivalry that would later grow into dangerous divisions. The political structure left behind was fragile, with governance systems modelled after British parliamentary democracy, but without the deep-rooted unity or institutions to support it. Political parties often aligned along ethnic or regional lines rather than shared national visions, making it hard for leaders to build consensus. In the early years of independence, these divisions surfaced in disputes over land, resource distribution, and political appointments. The Kingdom of Uganda, in particular, held a special semi-autonomous status during colonial times, and tensions rose when the central government sought to reduce its influence. Economic challenges added further strain. Uganda's economy relied heavily on agriculture, especially cash crops like cotton and coffee, but the wealth they generated was not equally shared. Regions that felt neglected by the central government became more susceptible to political unrest. The combination of uneven development, historical favoritism, and competing political ambitions created a climate of mistrust. The dreams of unity that had filled the air in 1962 soon clashed with the reality of a divided society, where the legacy of colonial rule continued to shape the course of the young nation's politics and conflicts. In January 1971, Uganda's history took a dramatic turn when General Idi Amin, the army commander, seized power in a military coup while President Milton Obote was attending a Commonwealth summit abroad. At first, many Ugandans welcomed the change, seeing Amin as a strong figure who promised stability and an end to political turmoil. However, within months, his rule revealed itself to be marked by repression, fear, and violence. Amin dissolved parliament, concentrated power in his own hands, and ruled through decrees backed by military force. His regime targeted perceived political opponents, real or imagined, with brutal efficiency. Thousands of politicians, soldiers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were arrested, tortured, or executed without trial. Ethnic rivalries intensified as Amin relied heavily on soldiers from his own Kakwa and Nubian communities, sidelining other groups in the army. In 1972, he ordered the expulsion of roughly 50,000 Asians, mainly of Indian descent, who had been a backbone of Uganda's commerce. Their departure crippled the economy, as many businesses collapsed and essential goods became scarce. Amin's foreign policy was unpredictable, shifting alliances between the West, the Soviet bloc, and Arab states. His erratic decisions and flamboyant self-promotion gained him international notoriety, but also left Uganda increasingly isolated. The military, once considered disciplined, became a tool for intimidation, its ranks filled with loyalists rather than trained professionals. By the late 1970s, dissent was growing both inside and outside the country. The regime's human rights abuses, combined with economic collapse, drove many Ugandans into exile. In 1978, in an ill-fated move, Amin ordered an invasion of Tanzania, triggering a regional war that would eventually lead to his downfall. The years of his rule left deep scars on Uganda's political, social, and economic fabric, shaping the struggles the nation would face for decades to come. The Tanzania, Uganda War began in late 1978 after a series of escalating tensions between Idi Amin's Uganda and Julius Nyerere's Tanzania. The spark came when Ugandan forces crossed the border and occupied part of Tanzania's Kagera region. Amin claimed the territory belonged to Uganda, framing the invasion as a reclamation of land, but the act was widely seen as an aggressive expansion meant to distract from his crumbling rule at home. The move provoked a swift and determined response from Tanzania, which had long been critical of Amin's regime and had provided refuge to Ugandan exiles opposing his rule. Tanzania mobilized its army. The Tanzania People's Defense Force, TPDF, and allied with Ugandan exiles who formed the Ugandan National Liberation Front, UNLF. The conflict quickly escalated into a full-scale war. Tanzanian forces, better trained and more disciplined, advanced steadily into Ugandan territory. Along the way, they received support from local communities eager to see Amin removed from power. The war was brutal, with fighting taking place in rural towns, border areas, and eventually the Ugandan capital. By April 1979, Tanzanian and UNLF forces captured Kampala, forcing Idi Amin to flee into exile, first to Libya and later to Saudi Arabia. The victory ended his 8-year rule, but the war left Uganda's infrastructure damaged and its political landscape in turmoil. For Tanzania, the war was costly in terms of resources and lives, yet it was also seen as a moral stand against dictatorship and aggression. In Uganda, the overthrow of Amin brought a brief sense of liberation, but it also opened a new chapter of instability as competing political factions vied for power. The conflict became a pivotal moment in East African history, reshaping regional alliances and setting the stage for Uganda's next turbulent political era. After Idi Amin's fall in 1979, Uganda entered a fragile transitional period, with various factions struggling to shape the country's future. In the disputed national elections of 1980, Milton Obote, who had been overthrown by Amin in 1971, returned to power as president. The election results were widely contested, with many believing they were rigged in Obote's favor. His return did not bring stability. Instead, it reignited political rivalries and deepened existing divisions. Obote's second administration faced a country still reeling from economic collapse, a fractured military, and widespread mistrust. In the north, he relied heavily on the Ekoli and Langi ethnic groups, which dominated the army, causing resentment in other regions. In the central and western areas, opposition forces, particularly the National Resistance Army, NRA, led by Yoweri Museveni, began a guerrilla war against the government. This armed conflict, often referred to as the Bush War, quickly escalated, with fighting concentrated in the Luaro Triangle. The war brought severe suffering to civilians. Government forces were accused of mass killings, looting, and destruction of villages suspected of supporting the rebels. The NRA also engaged in attacks, creating an atmosphere of constant insecurity. Thousands were displaced, farms were abandoned, and hunger spread as agricultural production collapsed. Obote's government struggled to rebuild the economy, which was burdened by corruption, mismanagement, and the ongoing war. International confidence in Uganda remained low, and foreign investment was scarce. By the mid-1980s, the army itself was increasingly demoralized, with defections and internal divisions weakening Obote's grip on power. In July 1985, his regime was overthrown in a military coup led by General Tito Okello, marking yet another shift in Uganda's turbulent political history and leaving the country still far from lasting peace. When Yoweri Museveni and his National Resistance Army took control of Kampala in 1986, many Ugandans hoped it would mark the beginning of peace and stability. Museveni promised a new era of unity, security, and economic recovery. However, while his government consolidated power in the south and west, the north and parts of the east became centers of armed resistance. Discontent in these regions was fueled by ethnic divisions, mistrust of the new government, and the legacy of past political favoritism. One of the most notorious insurgencies was led by the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, under Joseph Kony. Emerging in the late 1980s, the LRA waged a brutal campaign across northern Uganda, abducting tens of thousands of children to serve as soldiers or forced wives, and terrorizing civilian populations. Other rebel groups, such as the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, in the west, also challenged the government through violent attacks, further straining the country's resources. Uganda's military became heavily involved in regional conflicts during this period. The country played a major role in the First and Second Congo Wars, supporting rebel movements in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ugandan troops also intervened in South Sudan and later contributed forces to the African Union mission in Somalia, actions that expanded the army's regional influence but sometimes drew criticism for alleged resource exploitation and human rights abuses. Domestically, counterinsurgency campaigns brought both military victories and accusations of excessive force. Large numbers of civilians in the north were displaced into camps, where living conditions were poor and disease was widespread. The combination of internal insurgencies and regional wars kept Uganda in a near-constant state of military engagement, shaping its political landscape and leaving deep social scars well into the 2000s. In the 2000s and beyond, Uganda's military evolved into one of the most active forces in East and Central Africa, balancing internal security operations with high-profile regional missions. Internally, the army maintained pressure on the remaining rebel groups, particularly the Allied Democratic Forces in the west and remnants of the Lord's Resistance Army, which had shifted operations into neighboring countries. Counterinsurgency campaigns, while reducing the rebels' capabilities, continued to spark debates over the military's conduct and the government's broader approach to reconciliation. Regionally, Uganda became a key player in peacekeeping and stabilization efforts. In 2007, it was among the first nations to contribute troops to the African Union mission in Somalia, where Ugandan forces played a critical role in defending Mogadishu from al-Shabaab insurgents. The country also deployed troops to South Sudan during periods of civil conflict, framing its involvement as a stabilizing force while critics questioned the political and economic motivations behind these missions. Uganda's participation in regional security operations boosted its international standing and earned support from allies, particularly Western nations engaged in counterterrorism. Alongside military operations, there were initiatives aimed at fostering peace and rebuilding war-torn communities. Programs to demobilize former combatants, especially child soldiers, were launched, though challenges in reintegration persisted. In the north, gradual improvements followed the decline of LRA activity, with displaced people returning home and infrastructure slowly being rebuilt. However, the continued presence of the military in domestic governance and the suppression of political dissent created tensions about the balance between security and democracy. Uganda's modern military history reflects a dual identity, one of a force that has acted as both a peacekeeper abroad and a dominant political actor at home, shaping the country's trajectory through a mix of stability efforts and unresolved conflicts. The story of Uganda's military history is one of hope, struggle, resilience, and hard lessons learned. From the fragile beginnings after independence to the turmoil of coups, wars, and insurgencies, the nation has endured cycles of conflict that tested its unity and spirit. Leaders have risen and fallen, each leaving marks, some of progress, others of pain. Regional engagements have shown Uganda's strength and influence beyond its borders, yet the echoes of internal divisions and the scars of past violence remain. Through it all, the people of Uganda have carried the greatest burden, but also the greatest determination to heal and move forward. Their journey reminds us that true peace is built not just by the end of fighting, but by justice, inclusion, and the will to work together for a shared future.